Nice to see. Nice to see you all on the screen this morning, and thank you for all who've been involved so far. Addy, thank you for your reading. Orla, thanks for offering to cover prayers at late notice, and Dirk, lovely to hear from you. Maybe we could have a new slot of stand up with Dirk or something. I think I'd enjoy that. So we are in a little bit of a conversation process or season at this moment as a church, sort of church post-lockdown, asking some questions around our life together as a church, how we operate together, things that we do together. Given that things are changing, they have changed over the last 15 months, and now we're sort of going to be inching our way back to meeting physically. It'd be good to ask ourselves, how should we do church? And in particular, we want to ask it like this: do the things that we do, our common life together, our community life together, do they actually help us in achieving our aim or our mission? And our mission as a church is that we would follow Jesus by loving God, loving one another, and loving our neighbor. That's the three directions or three loves of our mission. This morning, I want to focus particularly on the last one, loving our neighbor or out. Last week in a conversation evening on Wednesday, we focused in general, and now we're going to focus on this last one for the reason that we've tried a number of different things with regard to loving our neighbor, reaching outwards over the last while. So I thought it'd be good opportunity to have a specific conversation around that. So that's where we're going. We're going to speak into this a little this morning, and then we're having a conversation evening, and there'll be another survey as well going out. And that's conversation evenings on Tuesday night. So I encourage you, please, to fill out the survey and come and have a chat. Me. Now, why me? I don't know if you ever feel or hear yourself speak those words. Why me? Pretty common expression. In my house, it becomes a child's complaint. I hear it a lot. Why me? As if I've singled out one of the three when something has happened. I like to think I don't, but I'm sure I do, time to time. For adults, it tends to be more maybe of a lament. It become a serious thing for us at times. Why me? That sense of why is it me who's going through a tough time? Why it's me who's suffering in some way? It can be a question that we ask of God. Something that maybe is a theme through the Psalms. Why me? We change the phrase slightly, it can be more an expression of ego. Why always me? This is about 10 years old, I think now. Balotelli, after scoring a goal in celebration, and there's a sense of ego behind his why always me. So it can be a complaint or lament, or it can be an expression of ego. Thinking about it this week, with regard to the question before us of mission, of reaching outwards, I wonder if sometimes it's just me. Really me? As in me? Am I the one who's called to do this? Does God want me to do something? That maybe not complaint or ego, it's actually maybe more something about confidence or a lack of confidence in these things. That maybe I'm not the type of person that God would use, that God could use, that God would call or choose to use in his mission to restore this world. So who would God call? Well, I want to look at the story again of Saul, who became Paul. It's a well-known story, I'm sure, to most of us, the Damascus Road experience. Addy's just read one of the accounts of it. So we know it, but I'd like us to listen afresh to some of what's going on in this story. Saul is a leader in the movement that is opposed to Jesus. He's a leader when violence breaks out. There's been persecution of the early church. By the time it gets to the end of chapter 7, that persecution becomes violent, and we have the murder of Stephen. And it says that when the crowd were doing that, they stoned him to death. The people involved, they laid their coats at the feet of a young man called Saul. There's some recognition that Saul was a leader in some way of this gang. who just engaged in this act of thuggery. As the story continues in chapter 8, it just tells us that Saul approved of these things, that, as they put their coats down, they were maybe seeking his approval or something. They were recognizing he had some authority and he approved of it. And then it goes on to tell us this great persecution broke out against the early church, and it was led by Paul. He set out to destroy the church. This is the person we're talking about. By the time it gets to chapter 9 of the book of Acts, there's this phrase which really struck me. 9 verse 1. Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. Something like that phrase, breathing out, just struck me, the sense that something deep inside Saul. It wasn't that he was just trying to climb the career ladder and get to the top of, some religious position. This is something he really believed, something close to his heart. He was breathing it out from inside him. He really believed in it. What we have here is a man who is violent, a man who is ideological, a man who is anti-Jesus. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that in today's world, you might call him a terrorist. We would use that word. He engaged in violent actions, he led them, he inspired them, and it led to terror within the early church. After his conversion, he goes to Jerusalem, and the early church there, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him. It says they were in fear of him because of his acts. They were in terror of this man. And if we step back and look at it from God's point of view, just step back in the story a second, we see that actually his persecution was not just of the church, but of Jesus. In our world, since Jesus ascended up to heaven, Jesus or God is embodied in this world through his church. He calls the church his body. And the cry in his conversion moment and his conversion story on the road to Damascus, when this blinding light stopped him on the road and a voice spoke to him, the voice is, "Why do you persecute me?" Saul's persecuting the early church, and Jesus speaks to him and says, "Why do you persecute me? This is an attack on me," a direct attack from God's point of view. That's who we're talking about. If we feel we have a lack of confidence of who God can use, God is picking this man who is opposed 100% to the person of Jesus. And yet God uses him. It is this dramatic conversion, this dramatic story. People in our world use the Damascus Road as a cliche. It's become such a part of our culture. For dramatic turnarounds. From being the leader of persecuting the early church, he becomes the great leader of the mission of the early church. God's chosen instrument, he's called, to the Gentiles. From being the great persecutor, he becomes the persecuted. The story of Acts tells of all these different stories of threats to his life, threats to his safety, but he's rescued each time. And actually, if we step back and see the broader scriptures, this is a pattern of how God works in his world. This is a pattern of how God is restoring his world. God picked a man who was inarticulate and afraid and stumbling to become his leader, to rescue his people from the great empire where they were enslaved. God picked a man who was a philanderer and a murderer, although at good points too, to be one of his great kings. So much so that his people long for another king like David. And God picked a man who was despised and rejected, a man of sufferings and familiar with pain, to be the person who would be the redeemer of this world. The pattern of how God works to restore the world is not what we expect. I think that should give us great hope. That gives us great hope that it's not about us. We shouldn't be coming feeling a lack of confidence or that God couldn't use us, because it's not about us. God does his work. It's God's mission. And he picks people, the most unlikely people, and uses them to help others and help them experience him and his goodness. So what we're going to do this week is we're going to give you a second survey. It's specific to mission, and there's going to be different questions in that. And some of them we're going to give you different areas of mission, about how you pray or how you bless others, physically or in word. And we're going to ask you to score them between 0 and 5, just to get a sense of where you're at, get a sense as a church of how we feel about these things. It's all anonymous again, so no need to be afraid. We're not going to know who has done it. It's just to give us a sense. But if when you're doing it, you think, well, gosh, I've only got a 1 here or a 2, God can't use me. No. If Paul filled out this survey, he'd be in minus categories. He'd be way back at -5 or -10. We'd have to break the scores to see where Paul was. God can use anyone. God does use anyone. God likes to use anyone. So that's, I think, one of the things that comes out of this story. But let me also just point out that when God takes us, uses us, changes us, he takes some of the things that are within us, some of our personality, some of our strengths, some of the things that we're good at, and he uses them. He changes them, he turns them around, he tinkers with them, he redirects them, but he uses who we are, as well as also giving us new gifts, what we call spiritual gifts in the church. And we see this in Paul. So Paul was always a passionate man. In one of his accounts of his conversion, when he's speaking it to the crowd, he says, I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. Twice in his letters, he uses that word as well, but how he was zealous even in persecuting the church in both Philippians and Galatians. He was a passionate man. He was zealous in what he stood for and what he believed in, even though he was wrong. But when God takes Paul and turns him round, he uses that part of his personality, that he was a passionate man, a passionate personality. Even though he'd used that in the wrong way against God, God then turns it round and he still uses that part of him. In chapter 9, he preached fearlessly, speaking boldly. He wasn't afraid, he was passionate. If we read the rest of the story through Acts, Paul preaches to an unruly mob who are looking to get their hands on him. He preaches to the Jewish leaders. He preaches to a governor. He preaches to a king. He goes all the way to Rome to preach there. He's a passionate man. God takes that bit of his personality and uses it. We look at Paul's strengths. Again, when Paul is trying to connect with his audience, he talks about how he was thoroughly trained. This is chapter 22 again, thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. And he writes about this in some of his letters as well. He knew the scriptures. He'd been trained from a young age. He'd studied under famous rabbis of the day. This was a core strength of him, his knowledge of the scriptures, what would have been the Old Testament, what we call now the Old Testament. But this strength had been misused for him. It actually led him to persecute the church, because while he had this great knowledge, he didn't fully understand what it was leading to. In Galatians, as he writes about this, and he just talks about how he persecuted the church, he links it to being extremely zealous for the traditions of my father. This great strength had led him to persecution. But still, God takes that strength and uses it and turns it around. He redirects it for the mission of God, to tell people about Jesus. So we see again and again in Acts, when he's preaching, when he's going to different towns, he talks about how he reasoned with them from the scriptures, or he proved to them that Jesus was the Messiah. He takes these Old Testament scriptures, one of his strengths, and uses it for Jesus, even though he'd used it against Jesus before. God takes our strengths, our personalities, and uses them. I was really encouraged just this last week speaking to a friend of mine. We haven't seen them in a bit, just with lockdown and everything, and it's just really good to hear of what God is doing with them. And my friend, her personality, and I guess her strength, is she's quite outgoing. She's an extrovert, you might say. She likes people. She's very sociable, and she's good at I guess building friendships, making friends. Now, part of her faith is that she invests in them. She tries to make them solid. She looks to reach out and bless. And then we were chatting to her. She just talked of these new people she got to know over lockdown. So much of social life had been sort of cut down and stopped, like for many of us. But she'd found new outlets. So she kept working over lockdown. And she was an essential worker, so she was working in the office and they had to keep a mask on. So at lunchtime every day, she was getting out for a walk with a colleague because she could get outside, she could take the mask off. And she got to know this colleague really well because they were walking for half an hour every day. In terms of friendships, things have been sort of harder to do in lockdown. But they live near the coast within their 5K, so she went swimming with a friend, someone who was a friend, but got to know way better because they went swimming once or twice a week in the sea throughout lockdown. Just really spending time getting to know someone. And then likewise again with her neighbor on the street. Finding herself, in the confines of her own house, but able to speak to her neighbor more. Bringing a chair out and sitting outside and chatting. And as we were talking, telling the story, she said that those 3 ladies and 2 others, as they were having those chats, things about life and even faith were coming up in the conversations because they were in lockdown. Life is so different. What is life about? Those questions were coming. And those 3 ladies and 2 others have agreed to sort of discuss faith with her. So she's having 3 Sunday nights, informal chats, not really sure what she's going to talk about or any material she's going to get, but they're just going to meet in her garden for 3 Sunday nights in a row and have a chat about faith. God is using her strength of her personality. Her faith has come in and that strength has been molded and refined, that she really invests in people. But God is using that. God uses who we are, our personalities and our strengths. And also with Paul, you see these new spiritual gifts come in. I couldn't really see any examples of miracles in Paul's life before when he was Saul, but there's tons of them in the book of Acts. Phrases about God using him, signs and wonders. We see exorcisms, we see healings, we even see a resurrection after an act of preaching. So God gives new things and redirects old things within us. And that's going to be a little bit of the survey that you get as well. It'll be asking you things that you find comfortable or things that you feel passionate about with regard to reaching out. And it can be new things and old things about who we are individually, and then we'll come together and see who we are together as a church. God uses us. But I don't want to finish there. I want to say that the whole part of the story is that for Paul, how he changed and then how God used him, including his old gifts and strengths, it was all rooted in this experience. One day, on one road, on one walk, on one journey, when he met Jesus. That encounter, that experience with Jesus transformed everything for him. When he speaks later about his ministry, his calling, he points back to this. There's times when he's talking to other churches, he has to defend who he is and what he's doing. And he comes back to this. He says, I had seen Jesus our Lord in Corinthians when they're questioning who he is. In Galatians, when they're questioning who he is and his message, he says, my message is from God because I received it by revelation from Jesus. He always comes back to this moment that he had an encounter with Jesus. And when we read his letters and sense his heart through these writings of his, we see that Jesus is just such a part of everything he does. Jesus has captured his heart completely and fully. When he, writing to Timothy, talks of the good news that Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, he says, of whom I am the worst. This message has gone deep within him. When he speaks of mission, he speaks of how Christ's love compels us, pushes us out, sends us out, like we saw last week. For Paul, to live as Christ and to die as gain. It's all about, comes back to this relationship with Jesus, this experience, this encounter with the risen Jesus. Encounter is key for us. Before we get into any of this, encounter with Jesus. Whether it's on the road to Damascus, or on the M50. We need to encounter Jesus. There's no road that is not known to God, no lane, no motorway, no footpath that we walk in lockdown that God does not know and that God cannot meet us. There is no cul-de-sac of life that we get stuck in that is far from God, where he cannot come and meet us afresh. It's all about encounter. God can meet us wherever we are, whatever road we're on. And it won't always be dramatic. In fact, it rarely is. But encounter is vital. An encounter with Jesus is what moves us in these new directions. Amen.